There is a place on this planet where the temperature can drop to -40 degrees Celsius, and the wind can steal the heat from your body faster than your cells can produce it. Where the sun disappears for months at a time, and the darkness is not the comfortable darkness of a bedroom, with the curtains drawn, but a total, absolute, bone-deep darkness that changes the way you think and the way you feel, and eventually, if you let it, the way you understand yourself. Where the ground is frozen solid to a depth of hundreds of meters, and the ice stretches to the horizon in every direction, and there is no tree, no building, no road, no other human being, for as far as you can see or travel. Where the cold is not a weather condition, it is a presence, a physical force with intention and weight and patience that vastly exceeds your own. And I went there, with nothing, no shelter, no tent, no sleeping bag rated for anything below 0. A very limited amount of food, and I stayed for 72 hours. This is what happened. This is what I learned. And I promise you, before this is over, you will understand something about the relationship between the human body, the human mind, and extreme cold that you did not understand before. Because the Arctic does not just test your physical limits, it dismantles your assumptions about who you are and what you are made of, and what it actually means to be alive. Subscribe right now if you want to see what the planet actually looks like in its most extreme and beautiful and terrifying forms. Let's go. Before I tell you about the 72 hours, I need to tell you about the preparation, because understanding what I brought and what I did not bring is essential to understanding what those 3 days actually meant. The location was a remote stretch of the Norwegian Arctic, above the 71st parallel, north of the town of Tromsø, in a landscape that in summer is one of the most hauntingly beautiful places on Earth, and in the depths of winter is something else entirely. Something that does not have a simple emotional category. Not beautiful in the way that things are usually called beautiful. More like standing at the edge of something vast and indifferent, and feeling yourself become very small, and very aware of the specific biological improbability of your own continued existence. I arrived in late January. The polar night was still in full effect. The sun had not risen above the horizon for weeks. What passed for daylight was a couple of hours of deep blue twilight in the middle of the day, the sky brightening to something like the color of a bruise around noon, before fading back into dark. The temperature when I left the last human settlement and walked out onto the plateau was -26 Celsius. The wind was coming from the northeast at roughly 30 kilometers per hour, which pushed the wind chill down to somewhere around -40. What I brought was this: a layering system of wool and synthetic insulation, base layer, mid-layer, outer shell, chosen carefully for the specific conditions, wool socks, 3 pairs, insulated boots rated to -40, a balaclava, insulated gloves with liner gloves underneath, a hat, a face mask for when the wind picked up, a small pack containing a fire kit, 2 methods of making fire, including a ferro rod and waterproof matches in a sealed container, a knife, full tang, with a blade long enough to be actually useful for processing wood and creating shelter materials, a small amount of food, deliberately limited, specifically high-fat foods, because fat is the most calorically dense fuel available, and in extreme cold, your body's caloric demand increases enormously. Nuts, hard cheese, a small amount of dried meat, a bar of dark chocolate, enough water for the first few hours, knowing I would need to melt snow for the rest, a headlamp with spare batteries, because in the dark of the Arctic winter, light is not optional. It is survival infrastructure. What I did not bring was this: a tent, a sleeping bag, a stove, a satellite communicator, though this is the one absence I will say clearly was a genuine risk and not a romantic choice. If something went seriously wrong out there, if I fell and broke something, if I became hypothermic in a way I could not reverse, the absence of a communication device was the difference between a rescue and a death. I want to be honest about that. I knew the risk and I accepted it, and I am not recommending it to anyone. But I want to be honest about what this actually was. Not an adventure in a controlled environment with safety nets, but a genuine confrontation with a genuinely dangerous landscape. The reason for the absence of conventional shelter and sleeping equipment was not recklessness. It was intention. The whole point of this exercise, The thing I had been thinking about and preparing for, over many months, was to understand what the Arctic is actually like, not from behind the glass of a heated vehicle, or from inside a down-filled sleeping bag, rated to -30, inside a four-season tent, but on its own terms, in the way that human beings, who have lived in this landscape for thousands of years, have engaged with it, not with the buffer of modern gear, but with the actual environment, the actual cold, the actual dark, the actual physical challenge of staying alive in a place that is not designed for human survival. The people who figured out how to live in the Arctic genuinely live there, not visit, not endure briefly and leave, but build entire civilizations on top of the ice and the permafrost and the frozen sea, did not do it with modern materials. They did it with knowledge, accumulated, tested, refined over generations, knowledge of the specific behavior of cold and snow and ice and wind, knowledge of the animals that also survived in this landscape and what they offered, knowledge of the human body and its limits and its surprising reserves, knowledge that was so thoroughly embedded in the practical life of Arctic communities that it was not experienced as knowledge in the abstract sense. It was experienced as the ability to do things, to make things, to respond to what the environment presented, to stay alive. I wanted to touch that. I wanted to understand, even approximately, even imperfectly, even briefly, what that knowledge actually felt like in the body, what it meant to look at a landscape of snow and see not a blank white void, but a set of materials and possibilities and problems to be solved. That is what the 72 hours were about. Hour 1 through hour 6. The first thing the Arctic teaches you, the thing it teaches you immediately, within minutes of arriving in it, without shelter, is that your relationship with time changes completely. In ordinary life, an hour is a background unit. Something happens in an hour, or it takes an hour to get somewhere, but the hour itself is not the object of attention. In the Arctic, with no shelter and the temperature at -26 and falling, an hour is an enormous and specific and very present thing. It is full of decisions and tasks and physical effort and calculations. It is not background, it is foreground, all of it, every minute of it, demanding attention. The first priority, always, in any survival situation, in extreme cold, before food, before water, before anything else, is shelter. The cold will kill you faster than thirst, faster than hunger, much faster than almost anything else that might threaten your life in this environment. Core temperature loss is the mechanism by which the Arctic kills, and it works relentlessly from the moment you stop generating enough heat through movement and metabolic activity to offset the heat you are losing to the cold air around you. The moment you stop moving effectively, the moment you sit down in the snow without insulation between you and the ground, the moment your clothing becomes compromised by moisture, either from sweat or from snow that has melted against your body and then frozen, is the moment the cold begins to win. So shelter, first, before anything else. The material I was working with was snow, specifically the snow of the Norwegian Arctic Plateau in late January, which has a specific character that I had read about extensively but had never actually worked with at this scale. The top layer of snow was wind-packed, hard, almost crystalline, the kind of snow that you can walk on in snowshoes without sinking very far. Below that, maybe 30 centimeters down, the snow was softer and denser, compacted by its own weight over weeks of accumulation, but still carvable with the right technique. A snow shelter works through a principle that seems counterintuitive until you understand the physics. Snow is an insulator, a very good one, as a matter of fact, because it is composed largely of air trapped in a crystalline matrix, and air is one of the best insulators that exists. The thermal conductivity of snow is dramatically lower than that of ice or rock or metal. This means that the snow itself, if you can get inside it, will protect you from the wind and slow the rate at which your body loses heat to the surrounding environment enormously. A well-constructed snow shelter can maintain an interior temperature of approximately 0 degrees Celsius or even slightly above, even when the outside air is at -30 or below, sustained purely by the body heat of the person inside and the insulating properties of the snow walls. 0 degrees Celsius is still cold, but 0 degrees Celsius is survivable in a way that -30 with wind is not. The difference between 0 and -30 is the difference between uncomfortable and dead. There are several types of snow shelter that different Arctic traditions have developed over thousands of years, and they vary in design and construction time and efficiency depending on the type of snow available and the tools at hand and the number of people building. The most famous is the igloo, the domed snowblock structure associated with Inuit communities across the Arctic, which requires a specific type of wind-hardened snow that can be cut into blocks and which, in the hands of an experienced builder, can be constructed in roughly an hour, and which is one of the most elegant engineering solutions to the problem of extreme cold that any human civilization has ever produced. A true igloo, built properly, with a small ventilation hole in the top and an entrance tunnel that traps cold air below the living level inside, is a genuinely sophisticated piece of thermal architecture that many modern engineers have studied and continue to study for the principles it embodies. But I was not in a landscape with the right snow for igloo construction. The wind-packed surface layer was too shallow to yield blocks of the right size, and the underlying snow was too soft to hold block shape. What I had available for the first shelter was a material suitable for a different technique, the quinchee. A quinchee is simpler than an igloo and less thermally efficient, but it is buildable with almost any type of snow and requires no cutting technique. You pile snow into a dome roughly 2 meters high and 3 meters in diameter. You wait approximately 90 minutes for the snow to sinter, which means to partially bond together at the crystal level into a more coherent mass, a process that happens naturally when disturbed snow is piled and left to settle. Then you excavate from the inside, crawling in through a low entrance and hollowing out the interior, leaving walls roughly 25 to 30 centimeters thick, thin enough to transmit a faint blue-gray light through them during the twilight hours, which serves as both a beautiful aesthetic detail and a functional safety indicator. If you can see light through the walls, they are not too thick, and a sleeping platform elevated above the entrance level to trap warm air inside. The construction of my first quinchee took 2 hours and 40 minutes. I know this because I was counting, not obsessively, but carefully, because time management in survival situations is not about anxiety, it is about information. Knowing how long tasks take tells you whether your plan is viable. If shelter construction takes 6 hours in conditions where your core temperature starts dropping significantly after 2, you need to change your plan. Mine was within the manageable range, but it was harder than I had anticipated, and for a specific reason I had underestimated. Moving large quantities of snow is enormously physically demanding. This sounds obvious when stated plainly, but the embodied experience of it, of shoveling and piling and compacting snow for 2.5 hours at -26, while the wind drives tiny crystals of ice into any exposed skin, and your fingers begin losing dexterity inside their gloves, and your breath forms an immediate cloud that partially freezes on your balaclava, and your body is generating enough heat through the exertion that you are sweating inside your layers. And the sweat, if it saturates your insulation, will compromise your thermal protection for the rest of the night. All of that is not captured by the word demanding. The physical chemistry of survival in the Arctic requires a very specific kind of sustained, modulated effort. Not too slow, because you need to finish the shelter before your body temperature drops too far. Not too fast, because overheating and sweating will compromise your insulation. The right pace is one that keeps you warm, without making you wet, and finding that pace and holding it in conditions that are themselves constantly pushing you toward extremes is an exercise in embodied calibration that I am not sure any amount of intellectual preparation fully equips you for. By the time the quinchee was complete, the twilight had faded, and the full dark of the Arctic night had settled. My headlamp carved a cone of yellow light out of the black. The temperature had dropped another 4 degrees. The wind had shifted slightly to the north, and I crawled into my snow shelter for the first time and lay on the elevated platform I had built and felt the temperature difference and understood, in my body, in a way I had not understood in my mind before, why the Arctic peoples of the world developed these structures. It was not warm inside. I want to be absolutely clear about that. It was cold. My breath still misted. My fingers were still stiff. But the wind was gone. That was the transformative thing. The wind, which had been a constant physical assault for the past 3 hours, the thing against which every calorie of heat my body generated had been fighting and losing, was simply gone. I was inside a shell of frozen water, and the wind outside was irrelevant to me, and the relief of that was so immediate and so profound that I lay in the blue-gray dimness of my quinji and did something I had not expected to do. I laughed. Not with happiness exactly, with something more like disbelief, with the specific emotional response that comes when the gap between the expected and the actual is larger than your body knows how to process quietly. Hour 6 through hour 18. The first night in the Arctic without a sleeping bag is an education in the relationship between your body and heat that I will carry for the rest of my life. I had the quinji. I had my layering system. I had a fire kit, but the wisdom of a snow shelter is that you do not build a fire inside it, because a fire inside a snow shelter melts the walls, which are the thing keeping you alive, and also consumes the oxygen that you need. And so the fire kit was for outside use, for cooking, and for the psychological value of fire in extreme darkness, not for interior heating. What I had for interior warming was my body heat and the insulating properties of my clothing and the snow walls. The cold does not come at you all at once when you lie down to sleep in a snow shelter in the Arctic without a sleeping bag. It comes in stages. First, there is the relative warmth of having just completed 2 hours of hard physical work, the metabolic afterglow of sustained effort. And this is deceptive, because it makes you feel like you might actually be fine, like your body has this handled. Then, as your body temperature stabilizes at rest, and the caloric cost of generating heat shifts from the byproduct of movement to the primary task of your metabolism, the cold begins to work through your layers more insistently. The ground, even inside the quinji, even on the elevated sleeping platform, is the main enemy. Snow is an insulator, but it is a cold insulator, meaning its equilibrium temperature is at or below freezing, and any point where your body is in contact with it, or with a thin layer of material over it, becomes a point of significant heat transfer. Every experienced Arctic traveler knows that insulation beneath you is more important than insulation above you, because the ground cold is more aggressive than the air cold when you are lying still. I had addressed this to the extent I could with the materials available to me, using the pack itself and everything in it as a partial barrier between my body and the snow, and removing and repacking items to maximize coverage. But it was imperfect, and the imperfection was felt in my lower back and my legs throughout the night. Sleep came in fragments. 20 minutes here, 30 minutes there, interrupted by the need to move, to generate heat, to check extremities for numbness, to shift position and redistribute the cold that was accumulating at any point of sustained contact. The interrupted sleep of a cold night without proper insulation is not the interrupted sleep of anxiety or discomfort in ordinary life. It has a different quality. It is purposeful. Each waking is a check-in with your own body, a scan of the systems. Is everything still working? Is anything numb that should not be numb? Can you feel your toes? Can you feel your fingers? Is your shivering controlled, or is it becoming the uncontrolled shivering that indicates your core is losing ground? Shivering is worth understanding because it is one of the most important physiological processes your body runs in the cold. It is your body's emergency heat generation system, a rapid involuntary contraction of muscle groups that produces heat as a byproduct in the same way that any muscular exertion produces heat. When you shiver, you are generating heat. This is your body responding correctly and actively to the cold. Controlled shivering is a good sign. It means your body is still compensating. It means you are cold, but not yet in serious trouble. The dangerous sign, the sign that means the situation has become critical, is when shivering stops unexpectedly without the underlying temperature having been addressed. This is called after-drop shivering cessation, and it indicates that your body has moved from active compensation to passive surrender, that your core temperature has fallen below the range where shivering is an effective response. When a cold person stops shivering and the cold has not been fixed, that person is in serious danger. This is one of the pieces of knowledge about the body in extreme cold that I had studied carefully and carried with me through that first night, monitoring my own shivering with the same attention I gave to my fingers and toes. I shivered throughout the night. controlled and purposeful and ongoing. My body kept working, and I fed it, getting up before what passed for dawn to eat a portion of the nuts and cheese in my pack, because caloric fuel is thermal fuel, and the difference between a body that has been fed and a body that has been fasting in extreme cold is the difference between having firewood and not having firewood. The food helped. Within 20 minutes of eating, I could feel the metabolic response, a slight increase in warmth that spread from my core outward, nothing dramatic, but real and measurable, in the way that only extreme cold makes these biological responses visible and appreciable. The twilight came just before noon, as it does in the Arctic at this latitude and season. The sky above the plateau went from absolute black through deep blue to a kind of luminous gray-blue that illuminated the landscape without warmth. The snow took on the blue of the sky and glowed faintly. The wind had dropped overnight, and in the still cold, the plateau was extraordinary, absolutely silent except for the sound of my own breathing, which was loud in the stillness, and the occasional distant sound that might have been the settling of snow somewhere on the slope behind me. I walked for 2 hours in the twilight. Movement as thermal management, movement as exploration, movement as the thing that the Arctic demands of you if you intend to remain in it on your own terms rather than on its terms. I was looking for several things: more sign of the landscape, understanding the terrain that I would be in for the next 2 days, water, or specifically, good snow for melting, because hydration in extreme cold is critical and often neglected because you do not feel thirsty in the cold the way you feel thirsty in the heat, but your body's fluid requirements do not decrease. Dry wood or other combustible material, because the fire kit is only as good as the fuel available to it. The last of these was the most challenging. The Norwegian Arctic plateau at this latitude is above the tree line. There are no trees. There is no wood lying on the ground. What combustible material exists is limited to the dry sedges and grasses and dwarf shrubs that poke up through the snow in sheltered spots, the wind having swept some areas clear to the frozen ground, and these burn but briefly and generate limited heat. I found enough to build a small fire in a sheltered bowl in the terrain, a hollow that broke the wind, enough to allow a flame to hold, and I used it to melt snow in the metal cup from my pack, producing enough water to drink properly for the first time in hours, and the warmth of the hot water going into my body was something that my nervous system registered with a response that felt almost embarrassingly grateful. Fire in the Arctic darkness is different from fire anywhere else. The quality of the light it produces, warm and orange against the absolute blue-black of the Arctic winter sky, the immediacy of the warmth at the distance of a few centimeters from the flame, the way it organizes space in a landscape that has no other organizing principle, the way it makes the dark outside the circle of its light feel more absolute. All of these things gave me a visceral understanding of why fire holds the central place it holds in every human culture that has ever existed in a cold climate. Fire is not just a tool in the cold. It is the organizing fact of existence. It is where life is, defined in contrast to the darkness and cold that surround it. Hour 18 through hour 42. The second day changed the nature of the challenge. The first day is physical. You are managing the immediate demands of cold and shelter and water and movement. Your mind is fully occupied with the practical problems in front of you, and there is something almost peaceful about this, the way that a very clear and immediate practical problem resolves the ambient noise of ordinary mental life. There is no space for the usual running commentary of worries and plans and half-formed thoughts. There is only the cold and what to do about it, and the very specific focused attention that the cold demands. The second day is psychological. This is the thing that the survival literature sometimes addresses, but often understates. The physical challenge of extreme cold, while real and serious and requiring constant active management, is in some ways the more tractable challenge. You can learn the techniques. You can build the shelter. You can manage the fire. You can understand and respond to what your body is telling you. But the mind in isolation, in extreme cold and darkness, for an extended period, faces a different set of demands, and these demands do not have the same kind of practical solutions. The silence of the Arctic plateau in winter is not a comfortable silence. It is a silence of a depth and completeness that urban or even rural dwellers in temperate climates have no reference point for. In a city, or a town, or even a farmhouse in the countryside, there is always something: the sound of wind in trees, the sound of animals, the distant sound of traffic, the hum of electrical infrastructure, the sounds of other human beings going about their lives. These sounds are so ubiquitous and so constant that they have become a kind of acoustic wallpaper, present but unnoticed, felt only in their absence. In the Arctic plateau in winter, the acoustic wallpaper is gone. There is wind when the wind blows, and that wind is enormous and fills everything and has its own kind of presence. But when the wind drops, as it did for extended periods on the second day, the silence that replaces it is so complete that you can hear your own pulse, your own breathing, the sound of your eyelids closing and opening, the slight creak of your clothing when you move. These are not quiet sounds. They are the only sounds, and in that context, they are very loud. And the mind, which is used to operating against a background of external sensory input, begins to fill the silence with itself, with memory, with imagination, with voices, with the fragments of songs and conversations that float up from wherever they are stored, with things you have not thought about in years, with fears, with hopes, with the particular clarity that comes when all the usual distractions are removed and you are left with nothing but your own mind and the landscape around you and the specific task of staying alive. I am not going to romanticize this. It is not uniformly wonderful. Some of what the mind serves up in that silence is uncomfortable. The fears that surface in the deep cold and dark of the Arctic are not politely managed by the usual strategies of distraction and busyness. They present themselves in full, and you deal with them, or you do not, but you cannot avoid them. The fear of death is the obvious one. Not because death was imminent at this point. I was managing well. The physical situation was stable, but because the landscape is so thoroughly organized around the possibility of death, because death is so clearly the outcome that is prevented only by continuous active effort, that the mind cannot avoid the subject. And sitting with that, in the blue dark of the Arctic twilight, with the snow stretching away to the horizon and the temperature at -28 and dropping, sitting with the direct and unmediated fact of your own mortality and your own smallness in a landscape that is so vastly indifferent to your existence, is genuinely one of the more clarifying experiences available to a human being in this particular era of managed and buffered and mediated life. It is not comfortable. Clarifying things rarely are. But it changes something. It changes the resolution at which you see things. It changes what seems important and what does not. I rebuilt a section of the Quincy on the second day, where one of the walls had softened and partially collapsed during the night. The repair took 40 minutes. I was getting faster, not because the snow had changed or the task had changed, but because I had developed a feel for the material through the experience of working with it, a kind of tactile intelligence about how hard to pack, how to read the consistency with my hands, where the wall needed reinforcing. This is a tiny example of something vast, the way that hands-on engagement with a material over time produces a knowledge that is entirely different in kind from the knowledge you get from reading about it. The hands learn things that the brain cannot learn by reading. This is true for snow and for wood and for rope and for all the physical materials of traditional survival practice, and it is a form of intelligence that modern education systems do almost nothing to cultivate and everything to atrophy. The second night was harder than the first, not because conditions were worse, though the temperature did drop to its lowest point around 3 in the morning, somewhere around -32, with a moderate wind returning from the north. The second night was harder because the body was tired, the kind of tired that sleep in a snow shelter without insulation does not fix, because that sleep itself is a form of metabolic labor, the body working through the night to maintain core temperature rather than resting fully. After 36 hours of sustained cold exposure with inadequate sleep, the physical and cognitive effects of fatigue begin to compound the effects of the cold. Decision-making slows, reaction time degrades. The temptation to stay still rather than move, to save energy, becomes stronger, even as staying still is the option that will cost you your life if the cold is serious enough. I understood then, in a way that the reading had told me, but the body had not yet confirmed, why the most dangerous phase of extreme cold exposure in many survival situations is not the first hours, when the body is fresh and the mind is alert and the problem feels urgent, but the middle period, when fatigue and cold and insufficient nutrition have accumulated to a point where the very faculties you need to survive are degraded by the conditions they are trying to respond to. The trap of extreme cold is that it eventually attacks your ability to fight it. It is patient, in a way that you are not, and the only counter is to be organized and disciplined before the fatigue sets in, to make the good decisions while you still have full access to your decision-making capacity, and then to follow the plan you made while you were still sharp, even when you are no longer sharp enough to be confident the plan was right. I had made myself eat on a schedule, regardless of hunger, drink on a schedule, regardless of thirst, move on a schedule, regardless of the desire to lie still. And that discipline, built into the structure of the time before the fatigue arrived, was what carried me through the second night, hour 42 through hour 60. The third period, from the end of the second night into the third day, was different from both what came before it. I am going to try to describe this accurately because it is the part that I had not read about and had not anticipated, and which is, in retrospect, the most significant thing that happened in those 72 hours. At some point in the early hours of the third day, before the twilight, in the full dark and cold of the Arctic night, something shifted. The discomfort was still there, the cold was still there, the fatigue was real and ongoing. None of the physical facts of the situation had changed, but my relationship to them had changed. The best way I can describe it is this. In the first day and the first night, I was fighting the environment, not consciously, not dramatically, but fighting it in the sense that every decision and every action was framed as a resistance to what the environment was trying to do to me. The cold was something to resist. The darkness was something to endure. The isolation was something to manage. I was in the Arctic, but I was not of it, in the way that a wall is in the ocean, but is not of the ocean, defined by its resistance rather than its relationship. By the third period, something about that frame had dissolved. Not because I had stopped managing the cold, or taking care of myself, or making good decisions about shelter and food and movement. All of that continued, but it had stopped being resistance and had become something more like participation. I was in the landscape, and the landscape was what it was, and I was what I was, and those were two true things that did not require resolution. The cold was not trying to kill me specifically, it was simply cold. The darkness was not trying to oppress me, it was simply dark. The silence was not threatening, it was simply the acoustic reality of this place. This sounds simple when stated like that. It is not simple when you are living it. The shift is not a thought or a decision. It is a change in the basic experiential quality of being in the place. And when it happened, the place became, for the first time, genuinely beautiful. Not threatening, not indifferent, not the beautiful because dangerous aesthetic that adventure content often reaches for. Just beautiful, clean, and enormous, and extraordinary. The stars visible in the gap between the clouds, the stars of the Arctic winter sky, which are not the stars of lower latitudes, which are brighter and more numerous and more present in the sky, because the air here is so clear and so dry and so far from any source of light pollution that the sky is what the sky actually is. Not a background to a lit landscape, but a lit landscape itself. The primary visual fact of the world, the snow catching and returning, that starlight in a way that makes the surface of the plateau glow faintly, even in full darkness. The absolute stillness when the wind stopped. The feeling of being very small in something very large, and that being, for the first time, not frightening, but right, accurate, true. I spent an hour sitting outside the Quingy, in that third period, in the dark. Not because I needed to for any survival reason, but because I did not want to be inside. Because the outside was where the thing I was experiencing was happening, and I did not want a wall of snow between me and it, even a thin one. I sat with my back against the outside of the Quincy, where it gave me some protection from the wind, and I looked at the sky and the snow and the absolute emptiness of the plateau stretching in every direction, and I understood something that I have been trying to find the words for since. The people who lived in this landscape permanently, the people who lived in landscapes like this for thousands of years, were not simply enduring a harsh environment through exceptional toughness, or exceptional technology, or exceptional community organization. Though all of those things were real and necessary, they were also, and perhaps primarily, people who had developed a way of being in their landscape that was not about resistance at all. That was about relationship, about knowing the cold the way you know a difficult but trustworthy companion, about knowing the dark and the silence and the snow and the ice in the intimate, specific, embodied way that you can only know something through long and attentive coexistence. About belonging, not in a sentimental way, not in a way that erased the danger or the difficulty, but in the specific sense of being a thing that has its proper place in a larger system, the way a bird belongs to the sky or a fish belongs to the water. Not despite the cold, but including the cold. Not by mastering the environment, but by becoming legible to it. I had spent 42 hours trying to survive in the Arctic, and the Arctic had spent those same 42 hours teaching me what survival actually is. It is not the absence of danger. It is not the elimination of discomfort. It is not the management of the environment into something more hospitable. It is the presence of knowledge and attention and respect, so thorough and so practiced, that the environment, which has not changed in the slightest, no longer feels like an adversary. Hour 60 through hour 72. The final 12 hours were the clearest and in some ways the most productive of the 72. The body finds a kind of equilibrium in extended cold exposure that is different from ordinary comfort. It is not warm, it is not rested, but the metabolic systems have adjusted. The caloric burning rate has calibrated to the available fuel. The shivering has become a kind of background hum rather than an emergency response. The sleep has become more efficient in that the body extracts what it can from the fragments of rest available. It is not health in the way that warmth and adequate sleep and proper nutrition are health, but it is a functional state, and in that functional state, with the accumulated experience of 2 days of living in the snow, the mind operates with a kind of focused clarity that I find hard to reproduce in ordinary circumstances. I spent part of the final morning improving the Quincy, adding an additional layer to the windward wall, where the previous night's wind had exposed a thin section, smoothing the sleeping platform, and making a small adjustment to the entrance tunnel angle that I had been thinking about since the first night. These improvements were not necessary for the remaining hours. They were made from something that felt like, and I realize this sounds strange to say about a snow shelter in the Arctic, care, the kind of attention you give to a home, to a space you have made and that has sheltered you and that you have come to know in the particular way that you know a space you have lived in, rather than merely visited. Then I walked. For 3 hours in the twilight, I walked the plateau, further than I had gone in either of the previous days, with a confidence in my navigation and my footing that had not been there at the beginning. The snow read differently to me now. I could see, in a way I could not see on the first day, the variations in surface that indicated wind patterns and depth changes and the subtle topographic features hidden under the uniform white. I could read the sky for coming weather, not perfectly, not with the extraordinary refinement of people who have spent their lives in this landscape, but more than I had been able to read it 48 hours earlier. I was beginning, barely beginning, to learn the language. The tracks of an Arctic fox crossed my path about 2 kilometers from the Quincy, a small, compact footprint pattern, the gait showing a trot that shifted briefly to a bound, where the fox had apparently found something of interest under the snow, perhaps a vole heard through the surface, and then resumed. The fox had been here, in this exact spot, while I was asleep in my snow shelter, going about its business in the dark Arctic night, with a completeness and a competence that made everything I had achieved in the past 2 days look like a very early draft of something this animal had been perfecting for its entire evolutionary history. I stood and looked at those tracks for a long time. The fox weighs perhaps 3 kilograms. It has no pack, no fire kit, no built shelter. It sleeps curled in the snow, with its extraordinary tail wrapped around itself for insulation. Its foot pads are covered in fur that prevents heat loss and provides traction on ice. Its ears are small, to minimize surface area and heat loss. Its entire body is an evolved solution to the problem of the Arctic, a solution developed over millions of years of selection pressure in exactly this kind of landscape. And that solution is so complete and so thorough that the fox does not experience the Arctic the way I experienced it. The fox does not survive the Arctic. The fox lives in it, genuinely, fully, without effort or struggle or the need to manage, lives in it. I am not a fox. I will never live in the Arctic the way a fox lives in it. I do not have the evolutionary history or the biological equipment. But standing in front of those tracks, in the blue Arctic twilight, having spent 3 days in the closest approximation to a genuine engagement with